Chapter 28 of Crystal, Part 2. A murmur passed over the dock, ponies glancing between themselves with visible unease, the flare casting long, hard shadows across their faces. Something splashed in the water out of sight, hidden by the bulk of the hull. Rarity's pulse quickened as she joined the Wakers and anxiously watching the ship above float silently closer. Something thudded against the hull, rocking it ever so slightly. The ponies standing near the edge stepped towards the center, eyeing the railing. "Steady," Jester hissed, eyeing their target. The thrum of the engines turned to a roar, and the gentle slosh of the waves grew in a frothy churning as the propellers buffeted them, causing the nearest parts of the city to sway side to side. A light appeared as a pony poked his head over the railing, a lantern held in its hoof. "Countess? Now, go!" The twang of drawn strings and taut coils filled the air as a half-dozen harpoons flew true, digging into the ship's thin metal hull with loud cracks. The Wakers didn't cry out in victory or roar a challenge. They moved with silence, clambering up the ropes with grunts and huffs of exertion barely audible under the din of the engines. At the same time, the deck beneath them jerked to the side, and Rarity yelped at the sudden vibration of impact that traveled up her hooves, joined by the heart-stopping sound of shattering wood. Pinky let out a sharp gasp, shoving Rarity and Fluttershy into motion. "Go! Climb!" Rarity didn't need to be told twice. She ran to the nearest harpoon gun, sparing only a brief glance for the stallion winding up its winch before wrapping her hooves around it and hauling herself up. It was far harder than climbing a proper ladder or net, and a distant part of her complained about the way the rough material chafed against the frogs of her hooves, but she paid it no heed, driven on by instinct. A shout of alarm sounded from above as some of the Wakers began to jump from their ropes, landing heavily against the merchant ship's sides and hauling themselves up by the hanging netting. From below, a cry of panic was met with a guttural roar. Rarity stole a glance down, eyes widening as she saw a creature squirming up out of a hole torn in the deck. It lunged for a stallion running for a rope, only to draw up short with a strangely comical squawk as Pinky ran over it with a giggle, crushing its tail under her wheels. Rarity couldn't watch. She trusted Pinky to keep herself safe, and so she decided to focus on the same for now. She clenched her jaw and climbed higher. The first Wakers hauled themselves onto the merchant ship's deck with loud, angry shouts, followed by a booming gunshot that made Rarity flinch. She steeled herself and pushed onward, forcing herself over the railing with a slight wheeze before finally rolling onto the deck. One mare marched up and down the deck barking commands, smoke curling from a gun at her side. But to Rarity's relief, it seemed that nobody had been shot. The few members of the merchant crew on deck were already cowering, stealing frightened glances around as they were herded towards the bow. A group of Wakers kicked down the door to the lower decks and stormed through, the dulled sound of their threats traveling around the ship beneath her, and soon more crew members were shoved up from below deck and brought to join their comrades. Rarity stood to one side, reluctant to get in the way, and breathed a sigh of relief when she saw Whitehorn brought up onto the deck, his muzzle set into a grimace as he was pointed towards the growing group of hostages. His gaze met Rarity's and went wide. She offered a sheepish smile. It was all over startlingly fast. Within a minute, the merchant crew had been rounded up and placed under careful watch towards the bow of the ship, a pair of Wakers already well through the process of tying them up. Fluttershy was seated next to one merchant pony nursing a bleeding face, but Rarity's blood went cold as she scanned the deck and realized that Pinky was nowhere to be seen. There was a scrabbling of hooves against metal, and a pair of exhausted Wakers pulled themselves over the railing, bruised, but wearing shaky, if manic, grins. Full seconds later, Pinky followed, a small, content smile on her face, and collapsed on the deck.
Pinky!
Rarity rushed to her friend's side, grimacing as she realized that one of her wheels was little more than a shattered piece of spinning scrap.
Are you okay, darling?
I'm great, Rarity,
Pinky said with a tired giggle. She reached up with a hoof and booped it against Rarity's nose.
Just had to make sure we caught everybody.
Cut the ropes?
Jester's voice rang out over the ship, ponies already rushing to comply.
Let's get some distance before the deep fish learn to fly.
She nodded approvingly before making for Rarity, lowering her voice to say a few words in passing.
Countess, the captain's asking for you.
She smirked, already moving past and barking new orders. Rarity sighed, turning back to Pinky.
Are you sure? Do you need anything?
Nope.
Pinky grinned back up at her.
I'm just gonna lie here for a bit.
Rarity nodded, reluctantly stepping away from her friend. As concerned as she was, she didn't want to interfere with Pinky's mood. It was so rare to see her smile like that anymore. She dodged around the commotion on the deck, making for the bow. It was easy enough to spot the captain. She was in the front row, leaned against a railing, her cape torn and her eyes narrowed in a hateful glare. Beside her, Whitehorn sat with an oddly calm expression, more curious than anything else.
Captain?
Rarity dipped her head.
You asked for me?
Countess.
The captain drew her head back and spat at Rarity's hooves.
Care to tell me which pit in Tartarus you crawled out of? Or will I have to ask myself when I arrive later today?
Rarity grimaced.
I understand you're upset with me, but nothing, Mare!
The captain snapped.
First you blackmail me into docking with a dead city, leaving your lackey behind to watch me like some unruly fool, and then, when I come back down to fetch you, you've gone and recruited a bunch of Celestia-damned pirates to steal my ship!
Rarity couldn't help but shy away from the accusations. Every word was true. And although she had known going into this that what she was doing was wrong, it was different having to face the mare she'd made a victim and hear it all spelled out.
And I'm sorry for that. Really. But sorry?
The captain let out a sharp laugh.
Some pirate you are. Don't even have the stones to look a mare in the eye after you steal her ship from under her hooves.
Rarity inhaled deeply, trying to calm herself.
I deserve this.
Still, she couldn't keep some of the edge out of her voice.
Did you have anything you actually wished to speak to me about, darling, or did you just want to yell at me? Don't you darling me, you pompous whore! You're just a treacherous blowhard, not a...
Rarity flinched as an iron-shod hoof smacked into the side of the captain's head, knocking her out cold. Her eyes followed the offending hoof to Jester, who just rolled her eyes before walking off and tossing a few playful words over her shoulder.
She's right, you know. No stones at all. Oh, goodness.
Rarity looked to Whitehorn, who was still eyeing her with that same apprising expression.
I imagine you must think terribly of me.
He cocked his head, tone strangely conversational. Perhaps you could explain your motives?
Yes, of course.
Rarity sat down, straightening up and bracing herself for the worst.
It's all quite involved, really, but the core of it is that we need an airship to save the city. And the plan is somewhat touch and go. I was concerned that the good captain would be so reluctant as to risk her vessel directly after all the effort took just to get her here, and so...
So you decided to hijack it instead? Whitehorn finished. He nodded, pulling the corners of his lips up into a wry smile. Very bold, Countess.
Aren't you upset?
Rarity hesitated, wondering for a moment if he'd misheard her.
Whitehorn, I've played a key part in the theft of an innocent mare's ship.
His smile widened into an earnest grin. But you did it for a good reason, no?
Well, yes, but...
Rarity stomped a hoof, her confusion shifting to frustration.
You should be mad at me! Livid! What I've done, I've just...
You're just doing what you think is right for everyone. Whitehorn nodded, closing his eyes with a bemused shake of his head. What was it Pinky kept saying? Everyone this time? He opened his eyes, gazing into hers with a quiet confidence that sent a chill down her spine. There's no shame in this, Rarity. You should take pride in it, even. Ponies like us, those who so yearn to help their fellow equestrian and yet can bear the pain of hurting one to aid the many, are vanishingly rare today. And we're needed now more than ever. Rarity felt like she should look away, but she found herself held in place by the intensity of his gaze.
You're not upset?
No! Celestia, no, Rarity. He actually laughed, and it occurred to Rarity that she'd never heard him make such a sincere sound since they had met. I'm proud of you. I know it was hard, but I know you made the right decision. And I'm here for you, just as you've always been for me. Together we can change Equestria for the better. We will change it for the better. Rarity wasn't sure how to respond. That look in his eye. He should be upset. She wanted him to be upset. He was supposed to be a noble pony like herself, striving to protect each and every victim from the cruelties that had become commonplace in Equestria. She had made her terrible decision to save Leviathan Wakes, tempered her reluctance with an icy determination to do what must be done. She wanted to be shouted at, to be chided and lectured and fixed with disappointed glares. She wanted to be told that though her decision could be understood, she should never do such a thing again.
I'll see about getting you untied.
She stood up abruptly, spinning on her hooves and trotting away. She had grown to trust Whitehorn like a lighthouse, guiding her through the murky fogs of the new age. Yet now she saw cliffs approaching, hard and merciless. And he told her to keep going. Somehow, that was more frightening than being alone in the dark. The room was silent, the air thick with unspoken questions. Twilight's mind raced as she stood before the stallion frozen in crystal. She had come here seeking answers, and yet every step deeper into the spire reminded her of just how dangerous the Shaper really was. Her eyes wandered, lingering on one of the partially crystallized corpses scattered around the floor. And she thought of Princess Luna, sound asleep at the bottom of the ocean, surrounded by bodies in a very similar chamber.
All these ponies.
She breathed.
You lie to them. They come down here thinking they get to serve their creator, and you kill them.
You would do well to watch what you imply, equestrian. The Shaper's deep voice made the very air buzz in Twilight's ears. Do you see marks of violence? Our chosen serve us to the end, as they are wont, but we do not bring undue harm upon them. They fade with smiles on their lips, honored to take their final rest by our side, and on the day of our reemergence, their names shall be sung by their descendants. as we carry each one in our mind.
Reemergence? He is trapped here then.
Midnight mused.
But by whom? And for what? Celestia must have done it.
Twilight pursed her lips, subtly probing out with her arcane senses and checking for hidden traps or curses.
This must be the creature that destroyed the world. Perhaps. But surely if the floods were cast by his horn, he would have stopped them before they reached his own lands.
Twilight's thoughts crumbled to a halt. She had no response. Midnight's voice echoed off the walls, imperious and haughty.
The ponies above claim you to be a god, and yet you do little more than play puppet with crystal and corpses. Who are you, truly?
The shadows darkened, swallowing up the dull light of the crystal blades around the room, and leaving only the dim glow of Shaper's smoldering red eyes. She stiffened, expecting anger, but his response instead came laced with pride. We are Shaper. We gathered the disparate tribes of the frozen north and carved them into a crystal empire. We pierced the veil of magics hidden in the darkest corners of the deepest caves and created artifacts to rival the might of alicorns. We bend flesh and soul to our will as a master smith bends the hardest steel. As he spoke, the shadows twisted around her, bright flashes of color briefly outlining dark silhouettes. Twilight saw a great tower in a wide valley between mountains, a 12-edged heart suspended between two narrow columns, and a crowned stallion with a curved horn, cape billowing out behind him. We are more worthy of the title God than your petty princesses, Equestrian, for we were not granted power by birth, but by the blood of our body and the cut of our mind. He kept going, his voice lowering into a bitter growl, as the shadows slithered back towards the walls once more. You speak to us now as a shadow of our power, but our return is inevitable. We have clashed with your princesses twice before, but their victories are ephemeral distractions in the unending story of our crystal empire. And when we return next, there will be no divinities to stop us, for even an alicorn mind cannot resist our magic. Her ears pricked up at his last words. She looked down, breathing out a trembling, quiet accusation.
So you admit it?
Speak clearly, Equestrian, Shaper rumbled. What is there for us to admit?
That you're the one behind all this pain? All this suffering? That you're the one who destroyed Equestria, who flooded my home.
Her voice grew stronger as hot anger stirred in her breast, overcoming her caution. She called on her magic, clinging to the pain caused by the spire's arcane resistance and throwing it into the hungry fire of her fury, spurring it on.
You're the one that caused all this! Who killed my family! Who twisted my body!
Bloody tears welled in her eyes and streamed down her cheeks, tracing the dark red stains left in her fur. The air began to hum with magic, the light of her horn driving the shadows back, like a predator fleeing from flame. Finally, Twilight looked up and fixed Shaper's frozen form with a sharp glare, throwing her words at him like weapons.
I'm ending it! I may not have been here when Equestria needed me most, but I'm here now, and we're going to kill you!
She screamed as she unleashed her power in a lance of brilliant light that made stars pop in her eyes, and the crystal shudder in sympathy under hoof, the blast cutting through the air with a shriek as if it too mourned for what was lost. The pain at the base of her horn grew sharper still, but it was nothing compared to the agony twisting her heart, and she embraced both sensations, pushing them into the attack. Finally, her enemy was before her, goading and proud, and in that moment, all the doubts that had plagued her past actions melted away, replaced by a singular, burning certainty. This was the monster that had destroyed her world, and she would end it before it hurt anyone else. Finally, her magic faded, her voice hoarse and her head pounding. The shriek of her spell echoed into the distance, replaced by a loud, discordant chime. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes, wiping her tears away. Where she had hoped to see a stallion crumble to rubble, there was instead a solid block of inky black crystal, vibrating hard enough the very shadows around it seemed to buzz. The shaking grew stronger, and then, with an ear-splitting snap, the crystal shattered. Twilight erected a flat shield with a hiss of pain, the flying shard slamming against it hard enough to make her wince. The Shaper stood untouched in the center of the room, ethereal smoke pouring thick from the crystal shell around his frozen eyes.
Fool!
His voice boomed, driving her a step back.
We are not a destroyer, but a builder, a shaper. If you wish to exact vengeance for your suffering, then stand by our side, for we have a common enemy.
Twilight spat, chest heaving as she called on more magic. She felt out with her magic, lifting the pieces of the broken statue scattered unseen against the walls, body trembling with exertion.
And who might that be?
Your equestrian princess, Celestia.
Twilight's anger faltered, but only for a moment. She cried out as she hurled the rubble across the room. Marble legs, heads, horns, and wings that had rested dormant for centuries crumbled to dust as spikes of dark crystal darted out from the shadows, filling the air with glittering shrapnel.
You're lying! Why should I believe you?
What cause have we to lie, whelp?
Shaper countered, shouting her down with enough thunder to make her bones shudder.
We are king! We are Shaper! It was Celestia who sent her agents into our empire to attempt to usurp our throne, and it was Celestia who came alone from her dying nation, mind befuddled by magic she could never understand, and sought to destroy us for sins we did not commit. It was Celestia who tore my creation apart with the power of the sun. It was Celestia who cast the spell that flooded the world.
No!
The shadows shivered and danced, squeezing against her little circle of light as images and sounds flashed unbidden through Twilight's mind. She saw crystal ponies wearing silks and gold running through streets paved with gemstones, overrun by shrieking beams of angry sunlight that left only ashes behind. A hall within the spire trembling as its walls exploded with hot energy, scattered pieces falling to the polished floors in the wake of an alicorn that glowed with blinding light. 3 colored gems, red, blue, and green, cracked, shuddered, and broke. And dark clouds gathered on the horizon.
It's impossible! She wouldn't...
All that pain and death, Millions of ponies swept away by raging waters, smashed to pieces against their own homes, starved in what few shelters weren't crushed by the waves. Celestia wouldn't do that. Couldn't do that. She thought of Stalingrad, dead limbs picked clean of flesh swaying from the windows of the high-rises like macabre flowers. Canterlot, old homes and businesses once vibrant with color and life, buried under heaps of rubble and haunted only by bloodthirsty, mutated changelings. And Ponyville, skulls popping under hoof, almost every building washed away but for her own home, where a team of researchers had watched the world drown around them. Everywhere she had been, Twilight saw the lingering shadow of suffering. She had imagined it all to be caused by some great evil, by some villain that she and her friends could have defeated if only she had been there. To think that Celestia herself could have caused it? The mare who had been like a mother to her, and every other equestrian.
Steady, little flower.
Midnight hissed in the back of her mind, and the terrible images faded away. Confidence filtered through their mental connection, stealing Twilight's mind, and she looked up to see Midnight standing over her, pushing the darkness back with her horns glow.
Do not give in to lies so easily. Hold on to your faith. We cannot defeat this enemy within his lair, but we'll need it later when we confront him again.
Twilight nodded, staggering back to her hooves. She fixed Shaper with a teary glare, fighting to keep her voice steady.
You're trying to trick me.
So our word is not sufficient. To be expected from one of Celestia's faithful.
Shaper spoke slowly, his voice dripping with disdain.
If you will not accept our truth, there is little proof we can offer. But perhaps you can find another truth elsewhere.
Twilight set her lips into a thin frown. She was exhausted, her fury having burnt down, leaving only embers behind. She knew what waited for her in the spire now, but she needed to retreat and reassess the situation. For now, though, she would keep him talking.
What do you mean?
You are not the first equestrian to walk these halls. Another came before you, also a follower of Celestia, though she did not have the luxury of ignoring truth when it confronted her. She is here no longer, but she has left something of herself behind, locked within our own castle by magic we cannot bypass.
His voice grew bitter as he spoke.
We can guide you to her secrets, and perhaps you will fare better. Though you may find it difficult to reject truths offered by one of your own.
Twilight hesitated, considering the offer.
That sounds like a trap.
A trap?
Shaper laughed with open disdain. The shadows flickered around her, and Twilight stiffened as she caught a glimpse of a wall of disfigured crystal ponies surrounding her, thin tendrils of dark smoke curling from their gemstone eyes.
If we have set any trap, equestrian, then surely you have already sprung it.
He's bluffing.
Midnight appeared beside her, lips curled back in scorn.
Even if we cannot harm him, we have proven we can defend ourselves. Right. We can humor him.
She offered a tired, sideways smile.
If it's a trap, we can handle it together. Fine.
She said out loud.
Show us.
The shadows danced around the room, drawing in close before forming a narrow path back the way she had come. Shaper said nothing, but he didn't have to. Twilight turned and followed the path with a weary sigh. She couldn't see the walls like this, but the crystalline shards and glowing holes helped her stay oriented. The path took her back down the hall towards the circular stairs, but turned to one side instead of descending. The scraping of crystal around her hinted at the possessed chosen watching in silence, but she didn't challenge them. Her hooves moved on autopilot, her mind focused instead on comparing what she'd learned with what she knew. Based on the Crystal Pony's legend, she knew that Celestia had come down here, fought Shaper, and the floods happened right before she left. It was possible that the legend was based on lies, and it had almost certainly been twisted by the passage of time, but she felt it unlikely that those parts, at least, were fact. No matter what Shaper may have told them, the Crystal Pony's ancestors had lived through the event themselves. Something had happened between Shaper and Celestia that caused the flooding of the world. She couldn't believe that Celestia would do it on purpose, and Shaper was adamant it hadn't been him. But he had to be lying.
Is he? What?
Twilight paused, brow furrowing.
Of course he's lying. It must have been one of them. This castle is ancient. You saw the stained glass. This place is as old, if not older, than Canterlot itself. Who knows what powerful magics or artifacts lay dormant within these walls?
Midnight paused, thinking.
Maybe it was an accident.
The thought left Twilight frozen. What if that was it? What if, in her effort to stop Shaper, Celestia had destroyed a powerful relic or cast some spell or curse that went haywire and accidentally caused the end of the world?
Or a different answer.
Midnight continued.
Perhaps Shaper tried to do something worse, something even more destructive, and Celestia flooded the world to save it.
Again she paused, letting her words sink in.
We are working with little information, Twilight. We can't afford to speculate over this matter.
Twilight nodded slowly. The idea that Celestia would ever do something so awful felt wrong. But acts of necessity were something Twilight had become very familiar with. How would her old self feel upon hearing all of the things she had done? Disgusted? Repulsed? Perhaps even violent. But Twilight knew she had made the right decisions, even when the right decision was only a matter of choosing the lesser of possible evils. The shadowed path came to an abrupt stop, turning sharply to one side and ending in a sturdy door of plain crystal. Tala walked up and tried the knob with her magic, wincing as she received a jolt of arcane feedback as a reward. It was sealed, closed, as Shaper had told her. Enchanted locks were problematic. Like any persistent magic without a caster to defend it, destroying the spell could easily have achieved via the application of force. Thus, a well-made magic lock was designed not to be indestructible, but to ensure whatever it protected would remain so if unwanted visitors tried to tamper with it. A cursory inspection confirmed her theory. Dispelling the lock would likely fuse the door into the wall, keeping the room's contents secure. Twilight cocked her head. Shaper couldn't get past this? She'd been bypassing locked doors ever since she'd learned the librarians had a forbidden section, much to the chagrin of her caretakers. It hadn't taken long for Celestia to give her a pass permitting her access to the entirety of the Royal Archives, which had saved her a great deal of physical strain as a filly. A sad smile came over her as she lingered on the memories. But only for a moment. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, drawing on her magic. The spire's resistance made it difficult, of course, but there was no spell she was more adept with than teleportation, and she had only a short distance to go. She focused on her breathing, brow furrowing as a pulsing pain formed at the back of her skull. Midnight lent silent aid as well, tinting their magic with a ruddy hue. The spell snapped into shape. All at once, Twilight's shield fizzled out, and bright lavender light flared around her. There was the familiar crackle of magic, and when she opened her eyes, she was through. She poured power into her horn, brightening its glow until, to her surprise, it reached all 4 corners of the room. It was relatively small, though with a high vaulted ceiling that her light still couldn't reach. Crystal tables weighed down with empty flasks occupied the center, and a chalkboard set into one wall was covered with a hazy smattering of chalk that might once have been busy lines of equations. The opposite wall was taken up by dozens of little box-shaped drawers, though the labels had long since faded. At the very center of the room, right before the door, the flasks had been set aside to leave a space conspicuously clear. A cylindrical glass vessel in the middle contained a thin sliver of pale blue crystal, casting soft light over a notebook and 3 small crystal chests, each just too big to comfortably fit into a hoof.
It's a lab.
A tentative smile flickered on Twilight's face as she stepped forwards.
Someone was doing research here. And an equestrian, if Shaper is to be trusted.
Midnight narrowed her eyes.
A very well-organized equestrian.
Twilight reached out and pulled the little chests closer. She immediately staggered back as she opened the first, briefly overwhelmed by the unexpected surge of magic energy inside, but recovered quickly. Peering inside, she saw mismatched shards of deep blue crystal, each individual piece glittering like the ocean on a starry night. She was ready when she opened the next chest, and so was less surprised when it radiated just as much power as the first. This one also held shattered crystal, though the pieces were a verdant green that seemed to writhe with life every time she moved her head. The last chest was odd in that the broken crystal inside appeared more angular, with no round edges. It was an angry red, gently pulsing, like a beating heart.
Powerful artifacts, even when broken,
Midnight said.
Perhaps these are the creations Shaper boasted of. Maybe. But why would they be locked away in here if he's the one that made them?
Finally, her attention fell on the notebook. She pulled it closer, a burst of excitement flaring in her breast when she felt the preservation magics wrapped around the pages. Whoever had left this here had expected it to be left alone for a long time and put great effort into ensuring that its contents would be legible once it was found. Twilight opened the cover with bated breath. Her eyes took in the first words on the first page, written in a playful but precise script that made her heart race with recognition.
Sunshine, sunshine, ladybug's awake.